Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our regular Simon Talks monthly webinar. I should introduce myself first. My name is Tony Geoghegan. Normally, Wayne Stanley, who is the Executive Director here in Simon Communities of Ireland, would host a webinar, but as some of you may know, Wayne has recently moved on, so I'm kind of filling in, holding the fort in the interim while there's a recruitment process going on. Anyway, notwithstanding, we're keen to keep everything moving, and these Simon Talks are a really important part of our function in trying to, spread issues around policy and good practice, etc., across the sector. So, as part of that, we're really delighted to have our guest today, Dara Turnbull, whose title of today's talk is Tools for Vacancy. So as I said, Dara is joining us today, and Dara Turnbull is the research coordinator at Housing Europe, where he has worked since 2019. In his role, he's responsible for managing various research projects working to improve the uptake of good practice by public, cooperative and social housing providers in Europe. He also leads the work of Housing Europe on a number of EU-funded projects, looking at areas as diverse as energy communities, the circular economy, and social engagement with residents. As an economist by training, prior to joining Housing Europe, Dara worked for 7 years in the banking sector in Ireland. He holds a master's in economics from the National University of Ireland. And he's recently published a report with Housing Europe titled Tools to Deal with Vacant Housing, which I'm sure today's presentation is based on. So just some housekeeping before we begin. If you want to follow us on social media, please use the hashtag SimonTalks. The general format of the talk is that Dara will present for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session. If questions come up to you during the presentation, please make a note of them, and there is also a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen where you can enter your questions, and we'll take them on from there. So without further ado, I'm happy to hand you over to Dara. Good morning, Dara, and you're very welcome.
Good morning, Tony. Thank you very much for that introduction. So indeed, it saves me a lot of time when I have to just introduce myself. I can move directly to the presentation. So hopefully you can see my slides. Indeed, as Tony mentioned, today's presentation is primarily based on a piece of research that my colleagues and I at Housing Europe did last year, which is about the topic of vacancy and the different tools and ways in which we've seen across Europe that people have tried to deal with this issue, with a particular focus on turning vacant housing into homes for particularly vulnerable parts of society, so people on low incomes, migrants, those experiencing homelessness, for example, but basically anyone who really needs support in order to access housing. So we see that there is a lot of potential there to do better than we have been doing, not just in Ireland, but right across Europe. So I'm going to try and give you some inspiration this morning about how we can actually do better on terms of vacancy. The picture you see here of this home is particularly personal to me. This home is a property which is right next door to my property, or at least where I live in Lille in northern France. It has been vacant in the state that you see here in the picture for a number of years now, despite the fact that officially, according to the signage outside, planning permission for some kind of new structure has been granted quite a long time ago, but yet no work has happened. And in intervening periods, the home has been squatted, has fallen to quite a lot of disrepair, and that's a real wasted potential. That could have been used as a home for the last 3 or 4 years for people who really, really needed it within my community. But instead, we see this kind of proliferation, profit-making, speculation, and people really not acting in the best interests of community overall. So that's what we're trying to tackle with the kind of research we do here at Housing Europe on vacant housing. So just to give you a little bit of background on Housing Europe, maybe some of you are familiar with us, but we are the European community for social, public and cooperative housing. So we represent primarily national federations, but also some regional federations, and indeed support agencies and bodies who try to promote access to affordable housing for people who need it. So in the Irish context, we would work with our 2 Irish members, which would be the Irish Council for Social Housing, the ICSH, and Cooperative Housing Ireland. But we work with similar organisations and bodies right across Europe, both inside and outside the European Union. And you can see some of the stats here. So based on a survey we did a few years ago, we estimated that our membership provides about 200,000 additional affordable homes each year, and renovates an additional 200,000 homes each year. So it's quite a consequential network in terms of its impact. And indeed, we estimate that in recent times, as our network has grown, and as we've seen governments which maybe had taken their eye off the ball when it came to provision of public housing re-engage with the sector, we estimate that the actual additional homes provided each year and renovated each year has increased. So hopefully we'll get updated figures on that quite soon. But just to give you a general sense of the impact of our network. Of course, today's talk is all about best practices, policies that have been shown to be effective in different national contexts, that could be adapted and replicated within other countries. And this really speaks to an ongoing piece of work from Housing Europe called Housing 2030, which is a collaboration between my colleagues and I here at Housing Europe, but also with the United Nations, specifically through the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe and UN Habitat. And the idea basically is to try to firstly identify housing challenges that exist in Europe today, and then move from identifying those challenges to trying to work out different policy tools that could be used to meet some of those challenges. So it could be in areas around access to land, for example, the requirement to renovate or rehabilitate the housing stock that we have to make sure they're more environmentally sustainable. It could be around financing, which is obviously a huge concern for many providers of affordable housing across Europe, or regulations, governance practices, and so on. So it's an ongoing effort from ourselves and the United Nations. If you go to housing2030.org, you can get access to kind of a catalogue of good practices, but also podcasts, videos, and other resources that could be very useful for people who are really interested in trying to make the connection between the problems that they see as housing practitioners on a daily basis and actually some of the solutions that have been implemented across Europe to try and deal with those challenges. I should also mention a project, an EU-funded project that my colleagues and I are working on called Equal House. It's very similar foundation and basis to Housing 2030, but maybe an expanded focus. So while in Housing 2030, we looked really at governance, land, financing, and environmental sustainability. With an Equal House, we take those bases as well, but we kind of expand them. So we look at things about acute housing needs, particularly for people from migrant backgrounds or people experiencing homelessness, for example. We look at issues like fuel poverty. We also try and analyze the data that's available to really kind of see what are the main challenges and trends, which type of households are struggling with access to housing in Europe today. And there is an Irish connection to this project because the project coordinator is the Geary School in UCD in Dublin. So I'm sure Michelle Norris and her colleagues who are leading the project would be happy to engage with anyone on this project further if there are any questions. Given that today's topic is about vacancy and how we can really tackle that issue, I should also mention an ongoing initiative called Shape EU. And basically what Shape is all about is district renovation. So we know that there are so-called bad teeth where you have individual vacant properties kind of dotted around communities. But in many cases, we see far more urgent issues emerging where we see whole neighborhoods, whole communities, which are kind of experiencing decline, and where there are many vacant properties or many vacant spaces. So it doesn't have to be residential. It could also be commercial or non-residential spaces. So for example, across many parts of Europe, there would be whole districts which previously would have been factories in areas like textiles. Those jobs obviously have now gone to other parts of the world. And we see a lot of brownfield sites, as they're called. So sites which are kind of currently being built upon, but could be used for other purposes. So Shape EU is really trying to bring together all the pieces on that. Again, it's an EU-funded initiative, and we're really trying to support communities who are trying to regenerate their areas and try to come up with a really holistic approach to tackling vacancy, but also adapting spaces to make sure they're better adapted to the needs that we see today For example, having a good mix between residential and commercial, making sure that communities are really vibrant and dynamic. And what we're trying to do here is make connections between existing projects, existing district renovation projects, and followers, so people who see potential within their own community to do something better in terms of providing affordable housing, but also providing really dynamic and inclusive communities. One of the questions we often get asked when we do these sorts of presentations is, okay, it's nice to have these good practices, but we need to have also some financing to support them. Within Ireland, of course, there is a financing structure for social and affordable housing. There's a financing structure for community engagement, and other schemes kind of that could be used for vacancy, which are unique to Ireland. It's also important to mention that there is an EU dimension to this. So we do see, and I'll highlight just some of them here, there are a number of funding sources available to stakeholders in Ireland if they want to use EU funding to try to kind of deal with vacancy or deal with community regeneration issues. I won't go through them all individually, but you can see here the different schemes, the amount of money that's involved specifically within the Irish context. Two that I would flag. So one is called Horizon Europe, which is basically the research branch of the European Union. It's how they fund research into kind of vaccines and different technologies. But within that, there's also a huge amount of funding dedicated to topics around migration, around inclusion, social inclusion, around employment and training opportunities, testing renovation approaches, and a whole number of kind of innovative sectors. And within that, we do see that there is a lot of potential for particularly social housing providers in Ireland to maybe use some of that financing to test new approaches to dealing with vacant housing, for example. So it could be that the European Union would fund an approved housing body, for example, to work on how do you convert office spaces. So we know there's a lot of vacant office spaces around Ireland now. How would you convert some of those spaces into residential usage? And that could be something that the EU would fund as grant financing. So it's a very attractive scheme. To date, we haven't really seen that Ireland's been very active in this sector. So maybe it's something that if there is anyone from the AHB sector on the call today, I'm happy to answer any questions on that and maybe help to steer you in the right direction in terms of accessing that funding. And the other one I want to mention quickly is the Social Climate Fund. This is a new initiative from the European Union to use carbon taxes effectively that are levied at the EU level and then use those to support vulnerable households, particularly who are dealing with energy poverty, to improve their circumstances. So it's really about trying to make sure that the renovation wave that's required across Europe doesn't mean that very low-income people are effectively penalised. Actually, we should be trying to find ways of supporting them financially to make sure that they too can participate in the renovation wave. So that will be roughly 800 million euro in funding for Ireland. And I know there's an election happening next week. It's quite prescient to mention this because actually Ireland's funding scheme, so basically Ireland has to set out to the European Union how they will use that 800 million euro. And that's something they have to do by June of next year. So that will be a really important job for the next government, whoever that might be, to decide how will Ireland allocate that 800 million euro, how can we make the best use of that funding to make sure that low-income people, vulnerable people, one, get access to housing, but also that people can be part of the renovation wave, and particularly low-income vulnerable people can live in more comfortable homes that are more energy efficient and that they can see a reduction in their cost of livings, which is obviously a huge topic in the election as well. So to really get into the nuts and bolts of the vacancy issue, again, as I was already mentioned, this is based on a publication we had out last year called Tools to Deal with Vacant Housing. It's part of an ongoing thematic publication series we have here at Housing Europe. We've looked at things like youth housing, housing for older people, modern methods of construction, and fostering social cohesion. I'd also like to make particular mention to Ali Harvey. I don't know if she's on the call this morning, but she has really been the champion of this work and pushed me and my colleagues to really look at this issue. So Ali was formerly of the Heritage Council in Ireland, but now she's moved on to a new role, but she's still been a huge inspiration to me and my colleagues in terms of this work. So thank you, Ali, if you're on the call, and if you're not, maybe someone could pass on the message to her. Okay, so when we think about vacancy, I think there are a lot of misconceptions out there about what vacancy is, how we should measure it, and different sorts of conceptual issues that need to be kind of really set in order. So right at the very beginning of the publication, I have this short paragraph, and if you'll allow me, I'm going to just read it to you because I think it's important to set this foundation for the rest of my presentation. So I say the housing vacancy is a complex issue which requires careful examination. Indeed, why homes become vacant can depend on many factors which generally relate to their location, local market conditions, and who owns them. As a result, when formulating policies to deal with vacant homes in an attempt to bring them back into use, policymakers must be careful to use measures that are well suited to the particular local context. And what I mean by that is vacancy comes in various forms. There are various reasons why a home might be vacant, and it's important that the tools that we implement to try and deal with that vacancy is sensitive to that kind of concern, and that tools are well targeted to tackle the particular type of vacancy that we see within an individual home or within a local area. And I'll get onto some of those factors now. Just to provide you kind of a bit of background where we are in terms of vacancy, this is an issue which is actually difficult to measure because every country has a slightly different concept of what vacant homes are and how they're measured. This here, you just see a brief selection of metrics we have on vacancy based on the recent census that was issued about in the last kind of 2 years in Europe. You see Ireland is highlighted there. So officially, according to the census data, 7.8% of the homes in Ireland were vacant on census night in 2022, if I'm not mistaken. And in the Dublin region, that was 5.5%, so a little bit lower. But you see right across Europe that generally speaking, vacancy tends to be higher outside of the capital city than within the capital city area. But that's actually not universally true. In places like France, in places like the Netherlands, actually we see slightly higher vacancy within the capital city area than other parts of the country. And there are various reasons for that, but primarily they're around property speculation, people trying to hide assets and other various kind of issues that need to be tackled because you cannot afford to have such high levels of vacant housing in areas with such high unmet demand or high unmet needs. So the big question, which I think needs to be again settled, is vacancy inherently bad? If there are vacant homes within the community, is that something that needs to be tackled as a matter of urgency in all cases? And what's interesting, and it's maybe a bit counterintuitive based on some of your kind of thoughts in this process, but I'm willing to have a conversation about it, is actually generally accepted by housing researchers that some level of vacancy is both normal and desirable. And that tends to be about 4 or 5%. In urban areas where there's a very high demand for housing, maybe a higher level of vacancy would be considered normal or desirable. And then maybe in rural parts of the country where there's less demand, maybe a lower level would be considered desirable. But the reason that it's desirable is that, of course, if you imagine a situation in which you live in one part of a country and you need to move to another part of the country and there are no vacant properties, obviously you're effectively going to be locked out of that area, right? So you need some level of vacancy because those homes need to be available for people who want to rent them or who want to buy them, so they can move around, they can take up education opportunities or employment opportunities. So having no vacancy within an area obviously creates an insider-outsider problem where people who live in an area can get a lot of benefits and people who need to access those benefits are effectively shut out of accessing those benefits. So some level of vacancy is usually considered to be normal. And that this is called natural vacancy or frictional vacancy. So it's homes that become vacant because they're for sale or because someone is moving out and a new tenant will then move in. So this really is not the concern for policymakers. What is the concern is what we call long-term vacancy. And different countries have different concepts of this, but typically, legally speaking, long-term vacancy is defined as a home which is vacant for 6 months or more in some jurisdictions, but that can be up to 24 months or more in other jurisdictions. But typically, the long-term vacancy is where the focus of policymakers should be, not on the kind of more short-term frictional vacancy, which is normal. So within our research, we defined 2 different categories of vacancy. The first one is involuntary vacancy, which we can define for the purposes of our research as being a vacancy that occurs despite the wishes of the property owner to sell or rent their home, or otherwise through no fault of their own. So here we have a brief overview of the different types of involuntary vacancy that can occur. So we see in many parts of Europe, not so much in Ireland, but in other parts of Europe, particularly Central and Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean, there can be an oversupply in the local housing market, meaning that there are more homes available to sell or to rent than are demanded at any given moment in time. That's particularly prevalent in areas of Europe where we see depopulating. So actually see people migrating, for example, from rural areas to urban areas, which then leaves an excess supply of housing in those rural areas. But again, it's something kind of quite exceptional overall, I would say. And indeed, in the Irish context, probably not very prevalent. Then there's kind of no fault vacancy. So it's not where someone is intending to leave the home vacant, but through personal circumstances that has been the case. So it could be people due to illness, maybe are now living in a nursing home or some sort of care facility. They have a temporary change in their personal circumstances to their family. Maybe they have to move on a temporary basis to another location, and in the intervening period, the home becomes vacant. Of course, quite pressing at the moment is the idea of conflict or war. We know that many people, for example, in places like Ukraine, are leaving homes vacant, not because they choose to, but because they have no alternative. And it could also be the case that it's unsafe to remain in one's home. So again, it could be in the case of a building defect, you have to leave your home because it's not safe to remain there. You're not intentionally trying to profit from leaving the home vacant. It's just a result of unforeseen circumstances. Another one which probably is more seen in Ireland is kind of legal disputes. So particularly around cases of inheritance or the seizure of assets, we do see that legal processes can mean that bringing those homes back into use can take a long time. Then we move on to the more prescient issue, which is kind of voluntary vacancy. So that these are homes where there is a demand that those homes could be put back onto the market for people to rent or to buy, but the owner, for whatever reason, is choosing not to do so. And again, to give you a few ideas of the types of vacancy that we see that as being voluntary vacancy, or why an owner might do that, the most popular one is the idea that they anticipate higher prices in the future. So imagine that tomorrow you inherit a home, right? And you see that the prices in that area are going up and up and up and up, which is again very common in most parts of Ireland today, where we see even above 10% property price inflation year on year. Why would you sell at home immediately? Wouldn't you, if you're trying to maximize your own economic best interest, wouldn't you simply hold on to that home and wait for prices to reach a higher level and then make a higher profit in the future? And that's what we see across many parts of Europe, that people basically are speculating with vacant properties. They're choosing not to rent them or to bring them onto the market because they think that in the future they'll get a better return on their investment or they'll make a higher profit. So it's really about personal greed over the need of society. We also see some evidence, it's hard to really pin down, we see some evidence of people attempting to artificially constrain supply, which is linked to the first point. So again, you might have a case where someone has a property, they're choosing not to rent it out or to sell it because they see that maybe there's an oversupply at that current moment in time, and they prefer to wait until another moment in time when maybe supply is a bit more constrained and they think they'll get a higher return on their investment. It could be that a home is used as a secondary residence or a holiday home. What's interesting is that maybe in the Irish context, we think of these type of homes as being in certain locations that are, places like Wexford or along the Atlantic coast, where they're really holiday homes. But in many parts of Europe, actually these are homes located within capital cities, large urban hubs. Paris is a particularly good example of this, and Paris has a huge number of what are officially designated as being secondary residences, so not your primary residence. And I think it's around between 8 and 10% of the homes within the city of Paris are not permanently occupied. They're actually used as secondary residences. And indeed, many of those homes are actually vacant. So that's a hugely antisocial way of behaving for people in an area where there's a huge unmet need for housing, for people to basically hold on to homes that they maybe use infrequently or on a few weekends a year, which is not optimal for society and needs to be challenged. I won't go on to the rest of them, but you can read them here. But yeah, there are many reasons why someone might tactically choose to keep a home vacant, and they need to be dealt with. I also could ask, why should we actually tackle vacancy? Why should we care? Why should policymakers really deal with this issue? And there are a few kind of points that I raise. So the first one was the environmental sustainability and heritage issues. We know, I've just cited a few of them here, but there is a huge body of academic research from across Europe that shows that actually in the majority of cases, it's more environmentally sustainable to renovate or rehabilitate an existing home than to build a new home. So in terms of the carbon that's being emitted, it's much more environmentally sustainable to use what you already have rather than emitting excess carbon. So if you consider an area like Paris again, where you have a huge stock of homes which are either vacant or being underutilized, you could make the argument, okay, we have an unmet need for housing in this area, let's build additional housing, which will have a huge impact in terms of carbon emissions. But if you just actually used better the stock that already exists, then you could house people and avoid those carbon emissions. There's also market issues here to consider. So the literature shows market impacts in both directions in terms of prices. So in some cases, high vacancy is actually associated with increasing prices for housing. That's particularly the case in Mediterranean parts of Europe, for example, places like Italy and Spain, where actually there is a legitimate demand in many parts of the country, but culturally people have migrated a lot within those countries. And what you see is that family homes, when older people are deceased, the families prefer to hold on to those homes because they feel a cultural or historical connection to a community, but they still leave the home vacant effectively, even though there's a demand for those housing units. So what we see is that vacancy in those areas can actually lead to higher prices. But in many other parts of Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, Germany is a particularly good example, East Germany that is, higher vacancy actually leads to lower prices because basically it precipitates the decline of communities and people don't want to live there. And then the more homes that are vacant, the more people don't want to live there, and then the more homes become vacant, and you end up with this vicious cycle. And then quality of life issues. So of course, anyone who has spent time living in a community with a high level of vacancy will tell you that it leads to many issues around the quality of life. Again, there's huge literature talking about increased levels of crime or antisocial behavior, but also things like just day-to-day stress or anxiety amongst residents. So when we consider the different policies that we can implement to deal with vacant housing, they're kind of a carrot approach and a stick approach. So if we're being generous to people who own vacant housing, maybe we could have a more supportive approach. Here are some of the ways in which governments across Europe are currently trying to encourage people in a positive sense or a supportive way to deal with the topic of vacancy. And they're typically different forms of public loans, grants, loan guarantees, tax rebates, setting up one-stop shops to kind of help people to deal with the issues that they have and so on. But I mean, it's basically supporting households who have vacant property, typically through financial means, to bring that home back into use. And we see these kind of types of programs even in the Irish context with things like well, I don't remember the name of the schemes now, but yeah, there are many schemes out there in Ireland where people are offered basically financial incentives to bring vacant homes back into use. And these have been successful to varying degrees across Europe. What's interesting, though, is maybe the question of social justice or correct use of public funding with these kinds of schemes. And what I mean by that is if you look at the analysis of the OECD, they've looked at actually who owns secondary residences, so the homes that actually could be vacant across Europe. And we see that the ownership of multiple homes is highly, highly concentrated within the top 20% of the wealth band or the kind of wealth distribution within populations. So typically speaking, people who have the luxury, if I can use that term, of having a vacant property are people who tend to be wealthier. That's not universally the case, of course. There are many complicated issues around inheriting second homes, for example, but typically that is the case we see across Europe, that people who have higher incomes and are wealthier have multiple properties. So there is a question about, is it fair and just that we use the tax revenues from the population as a whole to subsidize people who, many of whom are very, very wealthy individuals, to basically take action? Is that really a good use of our public resources? Ought we not to maybe punish those people or to use a stick to try and get them to do what we want them to do? Again, I'm not gonna definitively answer that question one way or the other. We go into that in a lot more detail in the report if you want to take a look, but it's a consideration that has to be taken by policymakers. Just to give you one example of the kind of the carrot approach that we think has been effective in some places. So in Spain, there's a very interesting system called the Masoveria system, which is roughly equivalent to sharecropping. If anyone is agricultural roots, they might be familiar with this concept. And basically, it's where a property owner gives use of a property to someone for a defined period of time. in return for certain services. So historically, it would have been laborers on farmland would have access to property in return for their labor on the farm. But in the modern Catalonian conception of this, which is a law from 2007, basically it would be someone or an entity or an intermediary taking over a vacant property in order to provide housing for someone who needs it, typically at below market rents. There's some really famous examples of this happening within Barcelona city. So one I highlight here is called Sis Claus, which is it was a vacant municipal building, I believe, office building. It was taken over by a new housing cooperative movement within Barcelona. And they signed a 75-year massive area lease with Barcelona City Council. So basically, in return for use of the building, the housing cooperative will renovate the building, bring it into use as housing for low-income people. And that's been a really successful scheme, and that has been replicated now in other parts of Barcelona and indeed Catalonia. So it's a kind of a win-win situation where the property owner gets their property maintained and looked out for a given period of time, and we get an increased supply of housing for low-income individuals. A similar scheme from the Basque Country in Spain. So they basically use the threat of punishment to encourage people to kind of nudge people who have vacant property to bring them back into use. They have one program called Safe Rent, a reasonable price, and this is where the Basque government will offer a guarantee to a vacant property owner that the rent will be paid, that maintenance of the property will be kept to a very high standard, and in return, that home is then provided at a below market rent to a social housing tenant, basically. So it's a way of leveraging in vacant properties to increase the local supply of public housing. Okay, so if we've outlined some of the supportive measures, but there's also kind of a punitive approach to dealing with vacant housing. So it's why you try to use penalties to basically encourage people to bring their homes back into use. And again, there are a few different ways this can be taken. So increased tax liabilities is one that's been used, for example, in the UK, where for every year that you leave a property vacant, your local property tax will increase. So I think after a couple of years it doubles and it triples and it quadruples. So basically, the longer you leave the home vacant, the more punitive the measure becomes. And basically, the idea is that once they ratchet up the pressure, at a certain point, you say, okay, I'm paying so much tax on this property every year. I just need to either rent it or to sell it. Another similar approach is fining the owners of vacant property. This is slightly different because it's more customizable. So if you're increased tax liabilities, your framework is the existing tax code and this existing tax system. If you have a fine, they're far more customizable to really target the homeowners and really hit them where it hurts. And again, this is being used in many different contexts across Europe. What I will say actually about this approach is quite interesting. In many parts of Europe, what we see is that they're using data from public authorities to try and identify vacant properties. So what they're doing, for example, is looking at consumption of electricity, water, and gas utilities within a property to try and then identify which properties within an area might be vacant. And they've had quite a lot of success on that in many parts of Europe. A policy which I don't think is currently being used in Ireland, but I'm willing to correction, is the requisition of vacant properties. So that's not where the state actually issues a compulsory purchase order for a property and they become the legal owner. It's where the state basically says, if you do not use the property within a given period of time to our satisfaction, we basically have reserve the legal right to appoint somebody to live in that property on your behalf. And that, again, that's become very, very popular because it means that the local authority, for example, doesn't have to buy the home. So that's kind of a saving for them in terms of whatever the market value of that home might be. But also it poses because you're not actually taking legal ownership, the legal hurdles, the legal barriers to this kind of requisition approach versus a CPO, for example, are lower. So it's actually easier to do, legally speaking. And then there's also the question of secondary residences. So in many parts of Europe, the idea of holiday homes is perfectly normal and doesn't particularly present an obstacle to creating inclusive communities because those homes are part of communities which are specifically designed for holidaying. But in many parts of Europe, as I said, in many capital cities, we do see people who have second residences. And the question is, can society as a whole really bear the weight of the luxury for want of a better word, of people having holiday homes in areas where there's huge unmet demand for housing. So just to talk about the topic of requisition briefly. So again, when you're requisitioning a home, you do not become the legal owner. You simply appoint someone. You kind of take temporary management of a property, if you like. So it's different from expropriation, in which the government or local authority will actually become the legal owner of a property. To give you a few examples, so in Amsterdam, recently they've introduced new powers for the municipal government to basically appoint a tenant to live within a home if it's been vacant for more than 12 months. And that tenant will usually be someone on the social housing waiting list within Amsterdam, and it means that the rent that they're being paid is below market rent. In France, vacant properties can be requisitioned for up to 12 years, and actually a recent reform of the law specifically mentioned that those homes could be used for people experiencing homelessness and other vulnerable households. So it's quite a severe penalty within the French context. In the Basque Country, homes can be requisitioned for an initial period of 5 years, and then an option to extend that for an additional 5-year period if required. And in Brussels, they've reinforced the legislation on requisitions in 2022, because this is something they really want to push forward. They see that there is a lot of vacant property within the Brussels region, and they want to have more powers, legally speaking, to requisition those homes. What's really interesting about this actually is that in many cases, once you tell a property owner that you're going to requisition their home, i.e. appoint a tenant to live there for a given period of time, then that's the wake-up call that the property owner needs. So what tends to happen is actually the threat of requisition is so strong that the property owner eventually will take action themselves before the requisition order is issued, and they'll rent the property or sell the property. So by threatening them effectively, you manage to get the outcome, which is what you wanted, which is bringing a home back into use that otherwise would not have been brought back into use. And even if the property owner doesn't take that course of action, then you get a benefit as well, because you increase the size of the local public housing stock. I'm running out of time, but I'll mention just very quickly a very important topic, something I mentioned at the beginning in relation to Shape EU, which is the idea of, okay, we can think of communities or towns or villages in Ireland where there might be individual vacant properties, but then there are also cases in which we have brownfield sites, we have maybe clusters of vacant properties, and that requires a slightly different approach, because it's not going home by home, it's going community by community. And just to give you a bit of inspiration, so again, in France, there's been a very successful scheme launched in 2018 called Operation Town Centre, in which they've made partnerships between municipal governments, but also public financing agencies, the National Public Investment Bank, local social housing companies. They've pledged 5 billion over 5 years to create about 15,000 additional homes, mostly affordable and social housing, within smaller cities, towns, and villages where we see these sort of vacant properties. So here, for example, the picture on the left is a property within a town centre which had completely fallen into disrepair, and then the picture on the right is that home post acquisition and renovation by a social housing company, and now that home is being offered as a affordable home right within the city centre of this community, and that brings people back into town centres and then helps to stimulate local economy, and it has a very virtuous cycle. One other approach, which is quite famous, I would say, at least within the academic literature and within the sphere of social housing research in Europe, is the so-called Aalborg model. So Aalborg, for those of you who don't know, is the 4th largest city in Denmark. Aalborg Ost, which was a kind of suburban community, a high concentration of social housing tenants, high levels of unemployment, high issues around criminality and other socioeconomic issues that really need to be tackled. And what they effectively did was put the non-profit housing corporation, which owned most of the homes within the community, at the heart of a new deal for that community, where they brought together tenants from all different backgrounds, local educational institutions, healthcare providers, infrastructure providers, get everyone around the table to come up with a very ambitious urban regeneration plan. That plan was then put to the local residents as basically a plebiscite or a local referendum, which was approved. And really the focus was on increasing community facilities, sports facilities, transport links with education and employment opportunities. And the impacts really speak for themselves. So we see that the number of residents and employment rose by 37% between 2015 and 2019. The average household incomes increased by over 20%. Higher educational attainment, lower rates of criminal delinquency, and so on. So again, it talks about what you can achieve when you have vacant properties, when you have social decline, and when you really bring together stakeholders around a table and they're empowered to take action, knowing themselves effectively what needs to be done at the local level. Again, here are kind of some pictures you can see kind of before and after. So almost all the properties were renovated, brought up to very high energy standards that help to improve the disposable income of households, for example. Here you see, for example, the new medical center, which is a very important part of the building. You see meeting of the residents and new community infrastructure. I won't go into this one per se, but this is another example from Sweden, very, very similar. Very, very high level of vacancy within the district. So about 800 of the homes out of 2,200 homes are actually vacant. So incredibly high levels of vacancy. But by bringing together the various actors around the table, they managed to come up with a empowering model for the local residents. And actually now what we see in this community is there's an unmet need for housing, and additional housing is having to be built. So going from a situation in which you had about 1/3 of the homes being vacant to actually new homes being built for people who want to move to the area because of how attractive it has become in recent years is a huge turnaround. And again, here you kind of get a sense. So one thing that was really key actually was that the social housing provider built their headquarters right in the middle of the community to really show to them that we're here and we are listening to you. And that was really important in getting the buy-in from the local residents. Okay, there's a number of policy recommendations I could make here, but I think I'm running out of time, so I won't go through them all. But I'd say overall, the big thing that needs to be done is that we fundamentally need to understand vacancy. So one thing we go into the report is the fact that right across Europe, every country seems to have its own concept of what vacancy actually means. And the problem is that in many cases, that leads to problems around identifying vacant properties. For example, in the UK definition of vacant properties has often been criticised because it seems very easy for people who have vacant properties to basically categorise them as holiday homes, for example. So that means it leads to a huge undercounting of the number of vacant homes, and we see similar issues around conceptualisation, data management, data gathering, and all across Europe. I mean, even in the Irish context, there are a number of different estimates out there in terms of the number of vacant properties, and they come down to the fact that the data collection methodologies are not uniform, concepts of vacancy are not uniform, and that basically, that confusion is to the benefit of people who had vacant property, and it's to the detriment of communities who need access to more affordable housing. So just by really making it clear what we actually mean by vacancy, and then going from that to actually having effective mechanisms to monitor vacancy. So using, for example, utility bills within communities to try and identify homes that might be vacant. And then once you go from having a good conceptual framework to actually measuring the number of vacant homes, you then need to make sure that public institutions are really empowered to deal with vacancy in their community. Again, in the Irish context, I remember, I don't know how it is today, but I remember a couple of years ago, the Department of Housing had actually provided funding for local authorities to hire dedicated vacant housing officers. And there was a report that basically said that less than half of the local authorities in Ireland had actually taken up that money, despite the fact that effectively it was additional staff for the local authority at no additional cost for the local authority. But despite that fact, they still hadn't taken up the opportunity. So there probably needs to be additional regulations at the national level, which actually compels local authorities to act on vacant property, but then also making sure that they have the right funding and tools in place to help them to meet that obligation. So that's basically the broad thrust of the policy recommendations. So really identifying vacant housing better, and then making sure that we have the proper structures in place to tackle it effectively and in a timely manner. So I think I spoke for a little bit too long, but hopefully it was informative, and I'm happy to take any questions.
No, thank you, Dara. That was a fascinating presentation. And I would encourage anybody who's tuned in today to look at the full report, that it really is an interesting read and gives some very concrete examples of both the carrot and the stick from across Europe, which are really interesting. So maybe I can just go to some of the questions. We do have a question in, which is asking, again, thanking you for the presentation, Dara, but asking you your view, do you think there should be stricter laws in place to stop people having voluntary vacant properties?
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't want to get too political on the Irish specific case here, but I mean, right across Europe, we see that there seems to be a lack of political will to really deal with this issue. I mean, there are many interesting cases, for example, where at the national level, so Ireland has quite a centralized government, so maybe it's not so applicable here, but at a national level, the government basically says, okay, we're going to provide a legal framework for you to punish people that have vacant properties, voluntarily vacant properties. But we actually kick that responsibility down the chain of command to local authorities. And then the local authorities are not actually compelled to act on that. They just have it's like a tool they have in their toolkit, but they're not actually obliged to use it. So actually we see a lack of political will, and that could be for various reasons. Of course, many parts of the political spectrum probably are not particularly motivated to act on vacant property because that would be impinging on their own political kind of cohort, if you like. So I think it's a mix of things. We need to make sure that there are tools, so better legislation around tackling vacant properties. So example, should there be legislation, really well structured legislation empowering local authorities to requisition homes in Ireland? That could be something that could be very, very useful that I think we don't already have. But then it's not just good enough to provide the tool. You need to make sure that it's actually applied. So to give you a good example of that, again, in France, at the national level, they set quotas for local provision of social and affordable housing. And then local authorities who do not meet those quotas are legally punished. So actually they're fined. So they say, okay, we don't care how you deliver it or where you deliver it. We're not going to micromanage you on that basis, but we're going to say nationally there's an obligation. That's impinging on you locally. And if you don't do what you're supposed to do, we're going to fine you. So could that type of approach be effective in Ireland? I think it probably could be. But again, in order for that to be fair and just, because I know many local authorities are under-resourced, and that's something we hear, and I think that's a perfectly legitimate claim. We need to make sure that that situation doesn't prevail, that actually local authorities are properly resourced, they have the tools, they have access to data, which can simplify the whole work for them. So I think if we create a far more cohesive structure, and if we really have political will to act on this, I think a lot of change could be made. I think it's not as difficult as some policymakers maybe would lead you to believe it is.
No, thank you, Dara. No, you're certainly stimulating lots of questions anyway. So there's loads of questions coming in. A lot around finance, people interested in how to access funding. So you mentioned the Horizon funding. Is that does that require partners, European partners, in order to access that funding? It is the normal kind of thing, is it?
Yeah, so like I said, Horizon is the research and scientific branch of the European Union's funding package. And it funds many different things, like I said, pharmaceuticals and healthcare and social services and many different things. But it also has a lot of emphasis on things like building renovations, modern methods of construction, social integration, dealing with migrants, dealing with homeless people. I mean, it's very broad. But yeah, what you would typically do is come up with what you would consider to be an innovative approach to a question. So if you're dealing with the idea of, okay, how do we convert vacant office spaces, which is a growing problem around Europe? How do we convert vacant office spaces into residential homes for people who need them? Because I mean, obviously office spaces, if you think about things like fire regulations, access to sufficient natural light, all these kind of things. I mean, an office is not the same building typology as a residential home. So how do we overcome these sort of challenges? Okay, we think we have an innovative approach. What we need to do then is test that innovative approach in practice in different European contexts. So you put together a consortium of like-minded individuals. So again, it could be, for example, an approved housing body finds other approved housing bodies in other European countries. You find a research institute who kind of has an expertise in, modular approaches to building renovations, that kind of stuff. And you basically try and put together a consortium. You pitch for funding to Horizon. If you're successful, then you actually have to go and do it. What's interesting is that is a grant financing. So it actually means that you're effectively given almost all the money you need. I think it's usually financed about 90%, almost all the money you need to actually go and do something real. And at the end of the project, you would actually end up with physical homes for people who need them. So Ireland has not really been at the races at accessing that kind of funding for these kinds of programs. There are many other countries in Europe, France, Spain, Italy, who are far more successful because they're really proactive in looking to put together these sorts of consortiums. So I would say, again, anyone from the social housing sector or anyone from the housing sector more broadly who's on this call, definitely look into Horizon. and try to be proactive in making partnerships with other like-minded individuals in Europe. Yeah.
No, thanks for that, Dara. Maybe that's something that we can put up on the website as well, a link to the Horizon, so that members can have a look there. Just linked to that now, you spoke about the new approaches, and you mentioned the Operation Town Centre. One of the questions was around, has there been any examples of, particularly in Dublin and in the major city, the main cities in Ireland, you see a lot of vacant over the shop type properties where there is existing retail happening on the ground floor, the first floor level, but yet there's vacant spaces above it. I'm wondering, is there any examples of initiatives to address matters like that?
In other European countries or in the Irish specific
No.
context?
I'm interested in other European countries. There hasn't been anything here that I'm aware of.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question because I mean, for example, I'm talking to you this morning from Brussels, although I live in Lille in northern France, but very similar building typologies. And the town centres in most European countries, not all, but most European countries are completely different than what we see in Ireland. I mean, mid density, as they call it, so kind of around between 3 and 5 story buildings are the norm in both Brussels and Lille. And what that really means is on the ground floor by default, you have commercial restaurants, cafes, bars, but then always above it's apartments. I mean, most people in Brussels, most people in Lille live in apartments. That's kind of the norm. In Ireland, that is not at all the norm. Ireland has the lowest percentage of people living in multi-family dwellings of any country in the European Union. I think it's about 10% of people live in apartments, basically, and then 90% live in traditional family, single occupancy homes. So the building typology between Ireland and the rest of Europe is completely out of whack. And that means that Ireland is particularly behind the curve in terms of promoting that kind of over-the-shop living. So, I mean, if you talk to partners in other parts of Europe, they wouldn't really understand what the challenge is because, I mean, from the original conception of these kind of buildings back, it could be over 100 years ago, over-the-shop living was part of the way these buildings were built. I've talked to different people from county councils in Ireland over the years about this topic and said, surely something can be done. I mean, we have small county towns up and down the country where you see people can't get access to housing, and you see most of the shops are being unused. And what they've told me time and again is actually the biggest obstacle they face is fire regulations. That for many of those buildings, yes, in theory, it would be great to have people living over the shop, and maybe in the past that would have happened. For example, if you had, I don't know, the butchers, maybe the butcher family lived over the shop and that was fine in a different era. But now fire regulations being what they are, that's apparently incredibly difficult. So I've heard it from a number of different sources that they would like to, they've looked into it, but basically the complexity of working with the building typologies we have in Ireland in most county towns makes it very, very difficult, very, very costly, if not actually effectively impossible. So I think it's a huge, huge challenge, and unfortunately, I don't have any easy solutions.
Okay, no, thank you for that. Again, there's been question in about the single vacancies and about trying to access grants for that, and that we know in Ireland, like there are a number of schemes, like the buy and renew schemes, etc., etc. But there's been very, very low uptake on them. I think to the end of 23, despite a huge target, there was only something like 900 actually activated. So I'm wondering, coming back to your kind of carrot and stick approach, you know what I mean? What you think can stimulate that, to encourage individuals to try and engage in the process.
Yeah, so I mean, one thing I didn't have time to go into all the different examples that are in the report, but I mean, one that I did mention, which could be maybe important in this context, is from the Basque Country. So actually in the Basque Country, they basically say they offer a carrot and stick within one package, which is a bit unique. Usually they're separate. Either there's a kind of public grant over here, but very, very rarely is there kind of a matching fine in the other direction, which pushes you towards the carrot. But in the Basque Country, that's basically what they do. They find vacant properties using, again, utilities data in many cases. So, okay, are we seeing any water consumption or gas consumption in the building? Okay, well then that lets us know that's probably going to be a vacant home. They have a much better property register in those in that context. I've heard from people in Ireland that actually, in many cases, contacting the owners of vacant property is very, very difficult because the owner might not be a legal person. It might be a corporation who maybe is not in Ireland, or maybe the address you have for the owner is not the current address. They could be living abroad, and there's many complications. But typically, that's also a problem. Having actually an up-to-date property ownership register would be a huge benefit. But what they do in the Basque Country is they basically find the vacant property and they go, okay, look, in this hand I have a big fine that you can pay, and in this hand I have a way you can cooperate with us to actually give us use of the home for a given period of time. We will then renovate that home if it needs to be renovated and bring it back into use as public housing. And we make sure that someone who needs it. And typically what happens is that people basically say, okay, well, I mean, I don't want to get fined. The fine is significantly consequential to mean that people really want to avoid paying it, and that they're then motivated to cooperate with the public authorities and hand the home over for people who need it as public housing. And that's very effective. So when you really present the carrot and the stick together in one go, I think it's probably going to be more effective. My understanding from the schemes in Ireland is that the carrot is clear, but the stick is not very clear. And even the stick, when it exists, doesn't seem to be particularly dissuading. I think the tax on vacant property, again, from my understanding from talking to officials in Ireland, one is quite easy to avoid or to object to. And two, set at quite a low level. So again, if you consider at the moment, in many parts of the country, annual inflation in property prices, residential property prices, is above 10%. But if the fine is much, much lower than 10%, well, you can think, okay, well, I could sell my home because I want to avoid a small fine, or I could hold on to it because I'm actually accumulating wealth every year I hold on to the vacant property. So maybe an alternative approach, and I don't know if any political parties in the next week's election are proposing this, but something to consider, is to set the tax actually equal or actually greater than the annual appreciation in prices. So actually every year you're guaranteed not to make any accumulated wealth gains.
No, thank you, Darrell. Yeah, no, obviously balancing the carrot and stick is a difficult thing politically, because obviously politicians don't want to upset their constituents either in terms of their support, etc. But notwithstanding that, look, that has been a fantastic presentation, and really, really interesting. And again, I would encourage anyone who's tuned in today to log in and have a read of the report. That it is really very interesting. So listen, finally, just to thank you, Dara, so much. And particularly, you do have insight into the Irish market coming from here as well. And that was evident in your answers as well. So thanks so much for that. More generally, for everybody that has tuned in today, I'd like to thank you all for tuning in, particularly, and to remind you that we won't have our assignment talks in December because of the month, etc., that's in it. But we will be resuming again with a full calendar in January. So if you watch your postbox, we will be issuing the list of talks and the topics, etc., going forward. So other than that, I think there's nothing more for me to do than to again thank Dara and to thank everybody for tuning in, and also again, given the time of year that we're approaching, to wish you all a very happy Christmas and also a very happy New Year. So thank you all very much.